A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
I was looking at some telemetry data from the Eastern Mediterranean yesterday, and it is wild how much the invisible architecture has changed in just the last few months. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the history and current state of military and defense cooperation between the United States and Israel. And honestly, the timing is perfect because we just saw that massive Iron Dome Next software update go live in February. It is one of those moments where you realize the old maps of alliances don't really show the full picture anymore. You have to look at the data streams to see where the real borders are.
It is a phenomenal case study in how a relationship evolves from simple arms sales to what I would call a fully integrated technical ecosystem. I am Herman Poppleberry, by the way, for anyone joining us for the first time. Corn, that February update you mentioned, is actually the perfect place to start. Most people see a missile interceptor and think about the kinetic part, the rocket hitting the target, but the real story of 2026 is the code. That update reduced intercept latency by 14% through edge computing optimization. That is not just a marginal improvement, it is a generational leap in how these systems talk to each other across the Atlantic. When you are dealing with saturation attacks where hundreds of projectiles are in the air simultaneously, 14% is the difference between a system that holds and a system that is overwhelmed.
14% sounds small until you realize we are talking about objects moving at Mach 5. That is the difference between an intercept over a populated area and one over an empty field. It is the difference between life and death for thousands of people. But before we get too deep into the weeds of edge computing and packet prioritization, we should probably frame how we got here for the listeners. Daniel is asking about the history too, and it is not like this started with AI and cloud integration. It used to be much more, mechanical. It was about steel and fuel.
It was transactional, almost purely so. If you go back to the 1970s, specifically the 1973 airlift during the Yom Kippur War, it was about hardware in its most literal sense. It was Operation Nickel Grass. The United States was literally flying tanks and jets across the ocean to replace Israeli losses in real time. We are talking about C-5 Galaxies and C-141s landing around the clock, carrying M60 tanks and A-4 Skyhawks. It was a lifeline, but it was a buyer-seller relationship where the United States was the ultimate warehouse. The strategic logic was Cold War containment. Fast forward to the 2026 Memorandum of Understanding, and the entire framework has flipped. We are still looking at a $3.8 billion annual military aid package, but the composition of that money tells the real story. $450 million of that is now a specific carve-out just for joint AI interceptor research and development. We have moved from shipping tanks to shipping algorithms.
That shift from hardware to software is really the core of the modern relationship. It feels less like a partnership and more like a co-development merger at this point. I mean, look at the way the United States uses Israel as a live-fire laboratory for defense tech. It is a bit of a grim reality, but the data coming out of those engagements is what fuels the next generation of American systems. Does the United States get as much out of this as Israel does? Or is it still primarily a one-way street of American support? Because from the outside, it often looks like the United States is just the bank.
It is arguably more balanced now than it has ever been, though the balance is in different currencies. The United States provides the capital and the foundational sensor networks, the global eyes, if you will, but Israel provides the real-world data loop. When a new drone swarm algorithm is tested in the Negev, the data from that engagement flows back to Fort Belvoir and American defense contractors within minutes. We talked about this a bit in episode 884, the idea of the digital handshake. It is this hybrid missile defense where United States-based command and control systems are now essentially hardwired into Israel's multi-layered defense. It is not just that they use the same parts, they share the same nervous system.
Right. The C4I integration. Command, control, communications, computers, and intelligence. That is the digital handshake we covered. But for the folks who didn't catch episode 8084, can you explain what that actually looks like on a technical level? How does a radar in the Negev talk to a server in Virginia in a way that actually matters during a combat window?
It comes down to sensor fusion. The United States operates the Global Ballistic Missile Defense Network, which includes satellites with infrared sensors that can detect a launch heat signature almost instantly. In the old days, that data would be processed, sent to a command center, and then a phone call or a high-level data burst would be sent to allies. Now, with the 2025 cross-border cloud integration, that satellite data is fed directly into the local Israeli batteries, like David's Sling or the Arrow 3. The Israeli system doesn't wait for a notification, it sees what the American satellite sees as if it were its own radar. This is where the Arrow 4 development becomes so critical. The Arrow 4 is being designed from the ground up to be cloud native. It doesn't just rely on its own nose cone seeker, it is being guided by a composite image of the battlefield generated by dozens of different sensors across the globe.
But that brings up a huge question about sovereignty, doesn't it? If the systems are that tightly integrated, where does one military end and the other begin? If we are talking about cross-border cloud integration that started back in 2025, is Israel actually capable of hitting the fire button if the United States decides to throttle the cloud support? It feels like you are giving up the keys to your own house in exchange for a better security system.
That is the sovereignty trap, and it is something the Israeli defense establishment is hyper-aware of. They have been trying to maintain a level of decoupling even as the integration deepens. They call it independent redundancy. But the reality is that the Arrow 4 interceptor is fundamentally dependent on United States supplied sensor fusion data to handle the high-end threats like hypersonic gliders. The United States has global ballistic missile defense satellites that see things long before local radar can. If you cut that feed, the Arrow 4 is essentially fighting with one eye closed. It can still function, but its effectiveness drops off a cliff. This is the trade-off. You get the world's best defense, but you lose the ability to act entirely on your own.
So it is a golden handcuff situation. It is interesting because you don't see this level of technical intimacy with other regional allies. The United States sells F-35s to a lot of countries, the UK, Japan, Australia, but they don't usually let them under the hood of the source code or integrate their national power grids into a shared AI targeting model. Why Israel? Is it just the shared democratic values, or is there a more cold-blooded strategic reason?
It is both, but the strategic value is often understated in the media because it is so technical. Israel is the only high-tech military in the world that is constantly engaged in high-intensity defense operations against a variety of threats, from primitive rockets to sophisticated Iranian-made hypersonic cruise missiles. For the United States, Israel is a giant real-world R&D facility. Every time an Iron Dome battery intercepts a rocket, the United States gets data on how to improve its own short-range air defense systems, like the ones they are deploying to protect bases in the Pacific. We are talking about thousands of successful intercepts. You cannot simulate that in a lab in Virginia. You need the chaos of a real battlefield to train the AI models.
That is a fair point. The battle testing is invaluable. But let's look at the second-order effects of this. When you have joint AI targeting models, who is responsible for the decision-making? If an automated response to a multi-vector drone swarm, like the one we saw in late 2025, results in an escalation that neither side intended, who owns that? We are moving into a world where the human in the loop is becoming a human on the loop, or even just a human in the architectural shadow.
That is where the ethics of algorithmic accountability get really messy. In that 2025 incident, the system identified a swarm of over 50 drones coming from 3 different directions simultaneously. The response was entirely automated because the human reaction time, the time it takes for a brain to process 50 targets and assign interceptors, was simply too slow. The AI prioritized targets based on predicted impact points, calculating which ones were headed for schools or power plants versus empty sand. It was incredibly successful, but it also autonomously decided to strike a launch site that was technically in a third-party country's territory because it calculated a 98% probability of a second wave. That is a massive geopolitical headache that started with a line of code written by a team of engineers who might have been sitting in Tel Aviv and San Francisco simultaneously. When the code is joint, the blame is joint, but the consequences are often local.
It makes the old guns versus butter debate we had in episode 548 look quaint. Now it is algorithms versus autonomy. And speaking of the geopolitical side, we have to talk about the new axis. We covered this in episode 555, but the pressure from Iran, Russia, and China is driving this technical integration faster than any policy paper ever could. If the new axis is sharing drone tech and satellite imagery, which we know they are, the United States and Israel almost have no choice but to merge their defense clouds to keep up with the processing speed required for modern warfare. You can't fight a unified threat with fragmented defense.
The comparison to NATO is actually quite revealing here. Within NATO, you have the Integrated Air and Missile Defense Framework, or IAMD. But NATO is often bogged down by 29 different countries having 29 different procurement standards, different political hurdles, and different levels of trust. The US-Israel relationship is much more agile. It is a bilateral fast track. They can push a software update to a battery in the Galilee faster than NATO can agree on a meeting agenda. This agility is why the United States is increasingly looking at the Israeli model as the blueprint for what they call software-defined defense. They want to take the lessons from this bilateral integration and eventually apply them to the Pacific theater.
Software-defined defense. That sounds like a fancy way of saying we are replacing generals with data scientists. But I want to push back on the one big happy family narrative for a second. We know from history, and we touched on this in episode 718 regarding the Jericho missile program, that Israel has always kept some of its most sensitive capabilities in the dark. They have this doctrine of strategic ambiguity. How does that survive in an era of total cloud integration? Surely there are black boxes that the Israelis won't let the Americans see, and vice versa. The United States isn't exactly known for sharing its most sensitive electronic warfare suites either.
There are definitely walls. Even with the shared cloud, there are air-gapped systems. The Israeli drone model, which we discussed in episode 1344, is a great example. While they cooperate on the big stuff like the Arrow system, their tactical drone swarms and some of their specific electronic warfare suites, the ones used for pinpoint assassinations or localized jamming, are strictly domestic. They have seen what happens when the United States shifts its foreign policy focus, like the pivot to Asia, and they are terrified of being left vulnerable if a future American administration decides to throttle the data flow. They want the integration for the efficiency, but they keep the black boxes for their survival.
Which brings us to the shifting public opinion in the United States. If you look at the polling among younger Americans in early 2026, that $3.8 billion annual check is becoming a harder sell. There is a lot of domestic pressure to spend that money on infrastructure or climate tech. If that aid gets throttled, or if it comes with more political strings attached, does the technical integration actually protect the relationship, or does it make it more brittle? If you can't easily unplug, does that lead to more resentment?
It makes it harder to break, but it definitely increases the tension. If you just buy a tank, you can stop buying parts for that tank and find a new supplier. It is a clean break. If your entire air defense network is running on a shared proprietary operating system that is updated weekly, you can't just walk away. It creates a level of technical path dependency that is much stronger than a traditional treaty. For better or worse, the two countries are becoming a single, inseparable technical entity in the defense space. It is no longer just about diplomacy, it is about system architecture. You can't change the diplomacy without crashing the system.
It is a fascinating evolution. We went from sending crates of ammunition in 1973 to sharing the same digital brain in 2026. But I wonder about the risks of that over-reliance. If there is a catastrophic failure in a shared algorithm, say a logic bomb or a zero-day vulnerability that gets into the unified cloud, both nations are exposed simultaneously. We are putting all our defensive eggs in one very high-tech, very complex basket.
That is the nightmare scenario. A single point of failure that spans 2 continents. And it is why the upcoming Defense Innovation Summit in Tel Aviv this May is going to be so critical. They are supposed to be discussing the next generation of sovereign AI, basically trying to figure out how to keep the benefits of integration while ensuring each country has a break glass in case of emergency, independent capability. They are looking at decentralized AI models that can run locally if the cloud connection is severed. I will be watching the white papers coming out of that summit very closely, especially anything regarding algorithmic sovereignty.
You and your white papers, Herman. But you are right, it is the big question for the next decade. For the listeners who want to track this, keep an eye on that phrase, algorithmic sovereignty. It is going to be the buzzword of 2027. It is basically the digital version of the old independence movements. It is about who owns the logic that decides when a missile is fired.
I think the practical takeaway for anyone following this is that the era of hardware-based alliances is over. If you want to understand who is allied with whom, don't look at who is buying whose planes. Look at whose servers are talking to each other. Look at who is sharing raw sensor data in real time. The US-Israel relationship is currently the gold standard for that kind of integration, but it also serves as a warning about how much control a nation is willing to trade for safety. The Iron Dome Next update isn't just a software patch, it is a testament to a world where defense is a subscription service you can't afford to cancel.
It is a high price, but when you are living in a neighborhood as tough as the one Daniel is asking about, I suppose the trade-off looks a lot different than it does from a comfortable office in the States. It is a constant balancing act between the need for absolute security and the desire for national agency.
It really is, and I think we have to give credit to the engineers on both sides. The technical hurdles they have cleared to make these systems interoperable across different languages, different hardware standards, and different security protocols is nothing short of a miracle. It is a massive human achievement, even if its purpose is ultimately a somber one. We are talking about millions of lines of code that have to work perfectly the first time, every time, under the most extreme stress imaginable.
Well, on that note, I think we've covered the broad strokes of what Daniel was looking for. From the sand dunes of the 1970s to the server farms of 2026, it has been a wild ride. We have moved from Operation Nickelgrass to the digital handshake, and the world is a much more complicated place because of it.
It has. And there is so much more we could dive into regarding the cyber warfare aspect, but that might have to be a separate episode. The joint operations in the digital domain, the offensive side of this relationship, are just as integrated as the missile defense, if not more so. We're talking about joint teams that operate in the shadows of the internet, often targeting the same new axis threats we discussed earlier.
Oh, for sure. We could spend an hour just on the Stuxnet legacy and how that evolved into the modern joint cyber commands. It is the same story: shared data, shared risks, and increasingly shared consequences. But let's save that for next time. We don't want to blow everyone's minds in a single sitting.
Agreed. This has been a great deep dive. I always enjoy peeling back the layers on these topics, especially when they are as complex as this one. It is easy to get lost in the politics, but the technology usually tells a more honest story about where things are headed.
Same here. It is one of those things where the more you know, the more you realize how much is happening beneath the surface that never makes it into the headlines. The headlines talk about the $3.8 billion, but the real story is in the 14% latency reduction.
That is the goal of the show, after all. To look at the weird prompts and find the deep substance, to find the story in the telemetry data.
We have definitely done that today. I think the key thing for everyone to remember is that this isn't just about politics or money. It is about a fundamental shift in how nations defend themselves in the 21st century. It is a software-first world now, and the US-Israel partnership is the leading edge of that reality.
The code is the shield, and as long as the threats keep evolving, the code will have to evolve even faster.
Well said, Herman. I think that is a good place to wrap things up for this one.
I agree. Thanks for the great questions, Korn. You always find the angles I am too buried in the data to see. You keep us grounded in the human element of all this high-tech machinery.
That is why we make a good team. You bring the research, I bring the but what if it all goes wrong energy. It is a necessary balance in a world that is moving this fast.
It is indeed.
Well, that is our look at the U.S.-Israel Defense Partnership in 2026. It is a relationship that has moved from the battlefield to the motherboard, and the implications are still unfolding every day. Before we go, we want to give a huge thanks to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes, and making sure our own digital handshake stays functional.
And a big thank you to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show. We couldn't do these deep dives into the technical architecture and process the amount of data we do without their support. This has been my Weird Prompts.
If you are enjoying these deep dives into the intersection of tech and geopolitics, a quick review on your podcast app really helps us reach more people who are curious about how the world actually works. It helps the algorithm find us, which is fitting given today's topic.
We will be back soon with another prompt from Daniel. Until then, stay curious and keep an eye on those software updates.
See ya.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, my weird prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to